Okay, so first of all, welcome to everyone to this event hosted by BERA and the Curriculum Journal. We are hugely grateful as editors, myself and my editorial colleagues, including Stavroula Philippou, who's here tonight, for the contribution, massive contribution of the guest editors of this recent special edition, and also all the contributors, most of whom are here today. So I just want to say a few words about the journal before I carry on here and hand over to Lizzie. The Curriculum Journal, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble seeing my slides here. I'm just going to try and fix that, and it won't work. Never mind. We'll try again. Right, that's better. Sorry. Technical issues, always a problem with Teams meetings. Okay, so first of all, just a little bit about the journal itself, and really just to plug it and hope that people would be interested in putting papers into us. The Curriculum Journal has had a long history now, over 30 years, of bringing together academic curriculum research with the perspectives of teachers and other professionals in the curriculum field. It was actually set up with that explicit aim. We're interested in papers, as you'll see from the aims and scope here, which are about curriculum issues, including related issues around professional learning, for example, policy development, assessment and pedagogy. So we've got quite a broad scope here, and we take quite a broad view of what curriculum is. We have taken traditionally a lot of academic papers, but from this year we've also got a new feature which is aimed at the perspectives of practitioners in education, and I'll say a little bit more about how people apply to do that. But we very much welcome proposals from people on topical issues in education which combine research and practice perspectives. We have a very international team. We're very widely dispersed here, you'll see from this. Newest member of our team, Grace Healy, is the person who's leading the practitioner approach, and I'm sure Grace would be very happy to give more information if people are interested in contributing, and there'll be more about that in due course, so keep an eye on the website. The special edition which we're going to talk about today, Decolonial and Anti-Racist Perspectives in Teacher Education and Training, is one of a series of special issues. We publish 4 times a year, and each year we try and have one special issue. We welcome proposals from people. In this case, we had an excellent proposal from Hira and Lizzie, which then was worked up into the special issue, which we're going to talk about today, and which you'll hear more about from the individual contributors. This was a particularly exciting special issue, very topical, and has aroused a great deal of interest. So I'm not going to say any more about this now, and I'm going to pass over to Lizzie to talk in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you to you and Stavroula and the whole Curriculum Journal team for the support that you provided throughout the development and through to today for this special issue. As you may know, I'm Lizzie Rushton, one of the guest editors, along with my colleague and friend Hira. Thank you also to all the authors and reviewers who've contributed to the special issue, and we're really reliant on your expertise. I'm very grateful to you all for the contributions that you've made to the special issue and to this event. So the structure of the event today is to really provide a spotlight on as many of the contributions to the special issue as possible. So we're going to hear from our first set of 4 contributors in a moment, who will provide a very brief overview trailer of their paper, and we really do encourage you to follow up and read the papers in full across the issue after the event. After our first set of 4 contributions, there will be some time for questions, at which you can pose on the Padlet, and I'll pop a link to that in the Q&A in a moment, but you can also find it in your calendar invitation to the event today. The purpose of the Padlet is to collate some questions that we will have time for after the first set of 4 contributions, and then after the second 4 contributions. But we also would like you to use the Padlet to share any resources or work that you as contributors or attendees are doing in this space, and we'll want to download the Padlet and send it out to you after the event, so that you can hopefully build further conversations and collaborations that come from connections that you might make in this event. Finally, we're really delighted that Professor Marla Moncrief from the University of Brighton has graciously agreed to provide a response and commentary to close the event, and we really look forward to that contribution. So I hope that's enough of an overview, and I'm going to hand over to Heather Smith and Vinnie Lander for our first of contributions of the afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Vinnie, could you share the slides, please?
Yes, certainly. Bear with me. Okay, so can you see that?
Yes, thank you, Vinnie. Hey, hello, my name is Heather Smith and I'm from Newcastle University, and together with my dear friend and colleague Vinnie Lander from Leeds Beckett University, we're going to talk very briefly about the anti-racism framework for initial teacher education, which we developed and which we wrote about in our BERA paper. Next slide, Vinnie. We recognise the need for such work because of, for example, economic inequities and a rise in the number of recorded racist incidents in schools, along with a policy landscape in education and in initial teacher education specifically, which has been steadfastly deracialised in the literal removal of reference to race and ipso facto a concern for racism. However, we have taken the approach advocated by Remy Joseph Salisbury and Laura Connolly to look for what they call pockets of hope and possibility in the contradictions and divergences which exist between activism on the ground in schools and in universities, such as the Why Is My Curriculum White campaign, and in recorded shifts in social attitudes on the one hand, and the ever more restrictive and obstructive world of initial teacher education on the other. Next slide, Vinnie. The anti-racism framework was founded on a global literature review, which found, for example, a clear need to embed anti-racism pedagogy into the initial teacher education curriculum rather than one-off tokenistic events. In terms of perceived barriers to anti-racism practice in initial teacher education, the curriculum, the literature showed a lack of confidence, knowledge and time as pertinent factors, and hence, therefore, there was a clear need for training. And so over to you, Vinnie.
Thanks, Heather. As part of our research that underpins the framework, we also conducted a survey of all providers in England, because of course the teacher standards for ITE and initial teacher training are specific to England. So just here is a sample of a couple of questions that were asked on the survey, particularly related to whether colleagues in initial teacher education adopted racist pedagogy in their own teaching. And as you can see there, 69%, just over 69% said yes, which was very heartening. And in 68% of our respondents said that they did teach their student teachers to become anti-racist pedagogues, but also they, just as the literature mirrored, they cited lack of time, expertise, mentors' expertise, and the lack of importance given to anti-racism on the course, and the lack of importance in schools, because the deracialisation has not just happened in ITE policy, but also in the school curricula, but also the Ofsted inspection framework. So these were all factors that were seen as barriers to the development of anti-racism. And just a few quotes there from our respondents in terms of why this work was so important. So, you know, one of the ones that struck me was, unless we interrupt racism in classrooms, we stand no chance of having a just society. And Just to say a little bit about the framework, it's organised on 3 levels: the overarching values and understandings, an executive summary of the global literature review, and then the themes: pedagogy and curriculum, student, teachers and placement, leadership and teacher education, and then looking at also school-based mentors, but also course evaluation processes. You can find the current framework on the Newcastle website. We are actually designing a more interactive framework to launch soon on the Leeds, Beckett and Newcastle websites. So that minimum entitlement of the CCF has to be maximised by purposefully undoing purposeful undoing by IT providers of the perpetual deracialisation of initial teacher education. So that's what we hope that the framework will do, and we hope to. It's by no means a complete document. We're hoping to add to it and develop it further. Thank you very much, and do have a look at the framework as it is at the moment.
Many thanks, Heather and Vinny. It's a really incredible work there, and look forward to seeing how that develops. Moving swiftly on, and we will have time for questions after our first set of 4. We'll be moving on to Josie Gabby, and delighted to hear from you now, Josie.
I'm trying to find how I can share my screen. Sorry. I can't seem to find share from my computer. Uzma, can you share? Is Uzma here?
Josie, do you have a button for share up right next to the leave button on the top right?
Yeah, I've got it. I can see it, but I can't seem to find how I can share from my computer.
So if you click on that, it should give you the option of several screens, and you can just pick the one that has got your presentation on it.
Josie, I'm going to try and share it for you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, sorry everyone. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining and for being part of this conversation, and to Haira and Lizzie for hosting this special issue event. It's such an important work and we still have a long way to go. It was such a great pleasure collaborating with my colleagues on this project, Anna, Diane and Uzma. So Uzma and I will share with you our work today. Next slide, Uzma. So far, calls to decolonize the curriculum have impacted ITE less than the rest of higher education due to ITE policy that upholds colonized ideals under the guise of traditional values and standardization. And this can also be seen on in Ofsted's inspection framework that doesn't acknowledge race and racism as key factors to the experiences of our Black and Asian students. That said, even in such challenging circumstances, efforts to dislodge teacher-student power knowledge hierarchies are evident, where co-authoring and collective writing between students and educators aimed at enabling geography students to thrive within teacher education can be seen to be so impactful. But such impactful work is also left to the will of individual teacher educators as well as subject teams. as a team, with my colleagues, we interviewed 9 white British teacher educators in primary and secondary education. We wanted to understand their perspectives on tensions, barriers, and possibilities of anti-racist practice in ITE. Most of what we know so far has been influenced by us, most of the research focusing on the experiences of our Black and Asian students. We wanted to understand the experiences of teacher educators. Uzma will share some of the key findings.
Okay, hello everyone. So I'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, so we've separated our findings into the 4 areas, the 4 themes that our data that we generated through our data. So the first one is educators confronting their positionality and orientation. So we found that whiteness was a key issue for our collaborators, and being dismissive of white privilege was something that came through as well. And there was a sense of guilt around delivering a Eurocentric ITE curriculum. So there's an awareness about the curriculum that we're delivering, and the guilt associated with not being able to put those changes in that, you know, they want. The tokenistic gestures that sometimes, you know, came from above didn't seem to resolve the deeper problems that were prevalent. And the second theme was actually propulsion points. So we found that the Black Lives Matter movement served to be quite, you know, a great propulsion point in how our collaborators were thinking and how they were confronting their own positionality. And, you know, this was across the board for a lot of people at the time. Setting specific access to knowledge as well. Our collaborators said that when they were working in schools, for example, they weren't necessarily aware of these issues and what anti-racism means and what this looks like in education. So actually working in higher education has given them access and given them a space to actually explore what they feel, how they feel about it, and what changes need to be made. And also this idea of silence being perceived as complicit. So if you are not, you know, if you are silent, then you are perceived as, you know, not engaging with these discussions, and does that therefore mean that you are complicit? Also a critical consciousness that's come through exposure to worldviews. So our interviewees said that, you know, being on, you know, their travels or being exposed to cultural worldviews through family, through friends, actually opened up, you know, how they feel about all of these issues. So having access to worldviews was a propulsion point as well. And the third theme that came through was subject-specific approaches. So we saw a disparity in primary and secondary educators, and how having a subject-specific approach often was the driving force between making these changes and not. So, for example, the history curriculum at secondary level lends itself quite nicely to decolonising aspects of curricula, whereas other subjects might not. And even, you know, with primary as well, our educators felt that there wasn't always a scope to explicitly decolonise primary curricula. So they felt that maybe secondary lends itself to that more. Also, individual examples were provided that were not prescribed through IT curricula, but through actually having autonomy as educators themselves. And this leads me on to the fourth one, which is a sense of responsibility. Collaborators have taken the initiative, an individual response to actually establish practices through a sense of responsibility to make these changes. And this is not something that's prescribed through policy or prescribed through top-down agendas. So there's a reliance on individuals' initiative and enthusiasm, and this can lead to a sense of fatigue and frustration as you know, it's driven through an individual need to make those changes. Josie?
Yeah, thanks, Uzma. Well, yeah, that said, there's also growing perceptible evidence of teacher educators' growing curiosity and commitment to exposing ITC is complicity in colonial practices. So there are some positives that we found. Thanks.
Thank you, Uzma and Josie. really fascinating. We've had pockets of possibility and propulsion points as some of the phrases there, and we'll now hear from Ian Cushing, who will share his work. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you so much. No slides from me. I'll just talk if that's okay. I hope that's accessible enough for everybody. So I'm Ian, just about to start at Manchester Met University. So thanks to the editors for organising this, and of course their brilliant work as editors. So the title of my paper in the journal in the special issue is Ratiolinguistic Policy Assemblages and White Supremacy in Teacher Education. And so ratiolinguistic ideologies are beliefs about language which frame racialised and low-income communities as displaying linguistic deficiencies. And those ideologies have a really long history. They were integral to how European colonisers drew distinctions between whiteness and non-whiteness, and how Black African and Indigenous populations were deemed to be less than human. Some of the other papers in this special issue also discuss language, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Oakley's brilliant work on decolonising EAL in the next paper. So in my work, I argue that ratiolinguistic ideologies are really integral to the policy assemblage that teacher educators in England must navigate, and that includes the teacher standards, the core content framework, and various documents produced by Ofsted. And so in the article, I begin by tracing some of those long histories of linguistic racism, as well as anti-racist struggles in teacher education in England in work by Black activists such as Bernard Cohard in the 70s, and then move on to a critique of teacher education in post-2010 landscape, showing how deficit perceptions about language are simply part and parcel of the increased level of control over teacher education curricula. For example, I show how the teacher standards reproduces ratiolinguistic ideologies and how it insists that all pre-service teachers must produce standard spoken English if they are to be perceived as legitimate teachers. And it's really important to emphasise here that standard English is not a neutral category, but a social and colonial construction which is based upon the language of the white European middle classes. Drawing on interview data with working class and racialised pre-service teachers, I also showed how they were instructed by school-based mentors to modify, or in some cases completely abandon, their own accents in order to gain their teaching qualification. And as I argue in the paper, this policing of language simply places the burden on racialised populations to modify their speech, and in doing so simply maintains systems of whiteness in teacher education. I also critique what in other work I've called the white ears of Ofsted, where I showed how ratiolinguistic ideologies are an institutionalised feature of the inspectorate. This involved compiling a database of thousands of contemporary teacher education reports, and what I found is that teacher education providers who serve large communities of racialised pre-service teachers were much more likely to receive hostile, degrading and racist comments about the purportedly deficient vocabulary and accents of marginalised students. Those very same ideologies are found in other key Ofsted documents, such as their recent subject-specific research reviews, training materials for inspectors, as well as the core content framework. And the CCF, I argue, in the final part of the paper, is a prime example of how deficit discourses have been normalised back into teacher education policy, where marginalised children continue to be blamed for their own struggles, as opposed to the broader systems of white supremacy and colonialism, which created that marginalisation in the first place. So this is the de-racialised policy that Heather and Vinny were so brilliantly talking about earlier. Finally, I end the article with a section on how teacher educators might push back against these oppressive policies by connecting issues of language struggle to broader issues of racial injustice, anti-blackness, and the white supremacist logics that pervade teacher education spaces. Thank you so much again for inviting me to contribute, and I'm so honoured to be part of this really important collection. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. As ever, incredibly insightful, important work. So we're going to finish our first set of 4 contributions from Oakley, and nicely linking again into discussions about language. Oakley, whenever you're ready, please do take it away.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. I'm going to try and share my screen. Did this the wrong way. Not what you want to see. There we go. Can you all see it?
Yeah. Okay, I can't see anyone, so I hope you can all see my screen. Hi, I'm Oakley Whelpley. I'm from Durham University, and I'm really excited and privileged to be part of this special issue in this event. So thank you to Lizzie and Hyra for organising it. And already it's really interesting to see the points of convergence and complementarity that there are across the different papers in this special issue. So I think that's really exciting to see as well. So I'll be talking about my article, which is English as an Additional Language, Decolonizing Provision and Practice. I'll be using the acronym EAL to talk about English as an Additional Language, just to avoid any confusion. And this article draws on research with EAL coordinators and support teachers in different areas of the UK. It draws on previous research, but in this particular article was interested in the ways in which students with EAL can be best supported and included in schools, where generally, as we've heard in the previous talks, where the curriculum and forms of instruction are predominantly monolingual and monocultural. So the premise for this research was very much that the relationship between language and education is far from neutral. Monolingualism is generally the dominant norm against which educational success is measured through forms of standardized language, which carry a lot of implicit assumptions. And monolingualism itself is a legacy of coloniality and modernity inscribed within 19th century nationalism, political constructions of the nation state, and colonial empires. And as was mentioned earlier by a number of speakers, in the UK, research has shown how students who arrive in school with different linguistic backgrounds are often perceived along a deficit model as less competent, as Ian was just saying earlier. There's also the phenomenon in wider media and political discourse where multilingualism, migration and education has been presented as a problem or even a crisis, at times a moral panic of the ideas that school can't cope with this linguistic diversity. So this is what we were interested in looking at when talking to EAL coordinators and teachers. The framework adopted by this article is based on the decolonial and anti-racist perspectives, inspired by the work of France Fanon, so Achille Mbembe, Alain Mabankou and Walter Mignolo. It highlights the way in which monolingual ideologies in schools are inscribed within ideas of linguistic superiority, which tend to construct the linguistic other as deficient and illegitimate. Such views are embedded within the symbolic domination of whiteness, and racism lies at the core of this imposition of colonial languages and the ways in which this supports forms of invisible domination in schools. So this paper was based on extended dialogues between researchers and EAL practitioners, and it identified three main areas that emerge as crucial to a deeper and more critical engagement with EAL and the experience of students, and I'll briefly cover that. So the first one was the need, this was what emerged from discussions with the EAL practitioners, the need for more critical questioning of ideas of inclusion and mainstreaming, and thinking about how these can lead to meaningful inclusive practices that can improve the experience of students who arrive in schools with different languages or little or no English. The other point, which echoes a lot of what's been said already in this event, is the need for active anti-racist work in schools and in initial teacher education. We've talked about the deracialization of initial teacher education, and this came across very strongly in work supporting children with English as an additional language. The third theme that emerged was decolonizing assessment and the need to really look at children's prior learning, prior forms of literacy and oracy, and being able to build on that to really offer inclusive experiences for students. So the aim of the article was also to make the data accessible and relevant to a wider non-academic audience. So we drew on storytelling and narrative and research and developed vignettes that could help us showcase the archetypal situations that EAL practitioners encountered in their work with EAL students. And these vignettes show how multiple times students' prior forms of literacy and oracy were overlooked. They also show how students tended to be labelled as other at the intersection of race, language and immigrant status, and how teachers often felt really ill-equipped or lacking the skills or confidence to develop more inclusive practices for EAL students. And to finish, I'll just share an extract from one of the vignettes that was developed with EAL practitioners. It's Emre, a young student who'd recently moved from Turkey, who says, "I really like poetry and I like reading and thinking about English poetry too, but I do not know what they want me to do here. The way they ask us to work on the poem, it is not like in Turkey. In Turkey, we would work hard to understand the meaning of the poem, the images it evoked, the themes and the ideas. Here they say, analyze this poem, but when I do it like in Turkey, it is not right. They want us to look at the poem differently. Why? I don't care about enjambment. It does not tell me anything about what the poem means." So I'll leave you on this. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope these presentations have made you interested in looking further into this special issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oakley. Really interesting to think about decolonising assessment in particular, and look forward to seeing more of your work on that. We are running a little bit, I always knew this was going to be ambitious timing, but we're running a little bit behind. So I'm just going to have time for one question, which I've picked up from the Padlet for Josie and Uzma. So Mark reflects that the finding around the challenges for decolonising primary curriculum really interesting, and have you any reflections on why your participants responded in that way, or any wider thoughts on that?
Yeah, when we shared with colleagues, most of our colleagues felt very uncomfortable in participating in this project, and most colleagues in teacher education are white British. Probably that's why this has been quite challenging, but we were so pleased that the conversations we had with colleagues were quite enlightening. Uzma, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think it was perhaps a lack of confidence in, actually putting something new into place that wasn't actually directed through policy or agenda or even heads of department, and actually having the structure there and having a framework to apply new curricula to. So I think that's the missing link for a lot of people, that we work with. It's just not having something as a reference point.
So it could be in that case something to do with the primary teachers' familiarity and confidence with the subject matter. Yeah, I think there's, I had an experience in Scotland with one of my master's students, which I want to just share quickly, if that's okay, Lizzie. I've got 1 second. Yeah, well, 30 seconds. One of my primary teacher MSc students had decided to do Black Lives Matter as a topic on the grounds that her class were really interested in it, and she was told by the head teacher that this wasn't possible because the immediate priorities are on literacy and numeracy. Now, I think that's a really rich topic to do, literacy and numeracy, personally, but I wonder whether some of the structural issues in the system, particularly issues towards attainment and performativity, are actually part of the problem here, and that they're experienced differently in primary schools than they are in secondary schools, where people are more confident in their subject matter. Just a thought, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just to add to that, I think that's where the disparity between primary and secondary came through in our interviews as well, with our secondary contributors feeling a little bit more confident and having the autonomy to make changes as an individual, based on having strong subject knowledge. And obviously with primary, they teach such a range of subjects, and you have performativity and you have all of these targets. Really quite strong targets in literacy and numeracy, and I suppose that's given more priority.
Great, thank you so much. And Dan, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I think we can see your screen. I don't know if that's a technical glitch or otherwise it's a little bit disconcerting seeing two of me. One is enough normally. Fantastic. So I'm going to hand over to Hira, who's going to chair the second set of 4 presentations. Thank you so much to our first 4 contributors. Really grateful for your expertise and time.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, and I second that. Thank you, everyone who just talked, and for the questions and conversations going on. Is always fascinating to what we've been engaging with this special issue for a while now, but listening to people talking is extremely exciting as well, beyond the reading of the papers. Although we encourage everyone attending this event, of course, to delve deeper into the papers and even further down, because everyone here in this special issue they all have published even more interesting and exciting ideas and papers about those topics. So please, as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, do check out the special issue and follow our amazing contributors' publications across different journals as well. It's very fascinating. So like Lizzie mentioned at the beginning, we have two blocks of presenters. So we are now moving on to the second block of contributions. And again, a reminder, please do ask your questions to the Padlet as well. We have the Padlet link going on for everyone joining us. So feel free to add your questions there, and then we will curate and post the questions to the second set of contributors once they are done with their presentations. So now I'm going to hand over to our first contributor to the second stage of our presentation. So we are going to hear from Susan Davis, King Yu, and Sammy Chapman. Thank you very much, everyone, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to, like everyone else, attempt to share my screen. You should hopefully be able to see that now.
Yes, thank you, Sam.
Brilliant. So yeah, firstly, thank you for providing the space for us to obviously talk about these important issues, and also to showcase the hard work of everybody around this this virtual room. So our article is the recruitment and retention of teachers of colour in Wales, an ongoing conundrum. It's Welsh Government funded research initially in the form of a report. Most of the colleagues who took part in the research and in this article are from Cardiff Metropolitan University. So just going through the pictures that you can see on your screen, we have Chantel Horton, Susan Davis, myself, Sammy Chapman, Eowyn Yefele, King Yu, Romo KK, and then we have Julian Compton, who was a practitioner representative on the project team from Willows High School. So it was basically born out of Welsh Government wanting us to conduct qualitative research on people's own written or spoken word. So we're aiming to capture the lived experiences of participants through what we labelled as courageous conversations rather than interviews, and that resulted in 68 semi-structured interviews taking place. And this was including Black and Brown students of 14 or over, unsuccessful applicants to ITE programmes, and also current practitioners. The article that is included in the special issue is kind of a repackaged result of the report that took place. And I will now hand over to Susan Davis, my colleague, and scroll down for her to talk about the second stage.
Lovely, thank you so much, Sammy. Diolch yn fawr. Prynhawn da pawb. Welcome everyone from Wales. Yes, basically, as Sammy said, we were tasked by Welsh Government to undertake this research. And one of the things that we were really keen to do was to really hear the voices of our participants and to give them an opportunity to tell us what it was like, basically at the chalk face, or whether they were students or whether they wanted to go into initial teacher education. So it was very much a work of heart, gwaith calon, in that we really had to respect and hear those voices. And one of the things that Sammy did as the research assistant on the programme, he sat in on the 68. I think you sat in on every single one of them, Sammy, didn't you? 68 interviews, and the interviews were at least an hour. Most of them went on longer than an hour. So listening to a lot of issues, a lot of hurt from those participants. Not always, and obviously there was a lot of celebration with people's achievements, but he did kind of go through the mill a little bit. And I think one of the things that we did find from the research was that there definitely was an emotional toll, which we called emotional buffeting, on the research team. And because we were colleagues, the majority of us had lived experiences. So what we found out, not a lot of this was new. We kind of knew where the participants would be coming from, but it was certainly a very, very interesting piece of research, and we do all feel very privileged to have undertaken it. So if I just tell you a little bit about the research findings. As Sammy said, we had these courageous conversations with the participants. And the reason we labelled them conversations was simply because the younger participants really didn't like the term interview. So we bowled up and said, oh great, we're going to do some research interviews with you. And they were like, no, because interview is a negative term for us, because when we've gone for jobs, when we've gone for things, we were interviewed and we didn't get them. So we changed it to research conversations. We also undertook this during the pandemic. So note to self, don't undertake a big research project in pandemic conditions. So that was one of the issues that we had. Plus we did have some gatekeeping from schools where schools didn't necessarily share the our emails with Black and Brown staff. So we were very lucky that we had, Wales is a very small country, and we mostly know there's only about 305 teachers from Black and Brown backgrounds in Wales, and through our BayMed Wales network and through other networks, we kind of knew quite a lot of the people. So one of the research participants, Chantel Horton, actually found somebody in Tesco's and asked them if they would be part of the research project. So that was how we kind of managed to get hold of people, really through our knowledge of communities. So we looked at a few different topics, or there were the research findings with us and themes with us. We looked at the idea of Black and Brown teachers being very much role models. I think we found that 99.9% of them felt that they viewed themselves as role models to other Black and Brown students and other teachers, and they felt a weight of responsibility. They felt that they needed to right wrongs. They were also involved in social justice work, so many of them undertook after school clubs, again to support learners and to you know, we heard the terms give others a leg up. That we heard that quite a lot. Well-being, this was an interesting one. Lots of participants talked about luck. That was a kind of a sub-theme, and the idea that they believed they were lucky if they had supportive head teachers or supportive colleagues, and also the idea that racism is cumulative, it's a lifelong thing, and some of the teachers told us that they still had self-esteem issues from racist incidents that happened to them when they were in school themselves. Racist incidents, it was really interesting that when teachers reported, we had a female teacher who reported a racist incident perpetuated against her by a pupil, and when she told her head teacher, the head teacher said, well, you need to control your class better. So they sort of spun it as a behaviour issue, and that was something that we found to be quite common. But we did find that participants were very resilient, that they kind of, you know, they kept on keeping on, if you like, and also the idea of them blending in and keeping their head down was another thing that we found. I think rejection was kind of mostly kind of the idea that it was down to when they went for jobs, when they went up against interview panels, the members were white, the governors are white in schools, so thus they felt that they didn't see themselves represented on interview panels. And also the kind of idea of glass ceilings, and was that case of sort of why would we try, because we're only going to be unsuccessful. And I think the other interesting thing was routes into teaching. Quite a few of the participants who were current teachers had kind of been around the block, if you like. They'd maybe undertaken different careers before they'd gone into teaching, so they didn't have a linear progression into teaching. And what we found was quite a few of the older participants had left school at 16 with very little qualification and had done their qualifications later on. Not all of the participants, but a few of them. And I think that the idea as well with leadership was that the Black and Brown teachers did step up to kind of leadership roles, but they were mostly to cover full-time roles of white colleagues, and then that didn't translate then into them being promoted within their schools. So it was a very kind of that was the kind of the sort of what we discovered from speaking to the participants. I'm going to pass you over now to my colleague Kinyu, who's going to talk about the research impact from our work.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Sammy. Yes, so we're happy to report that our research has actually had significant impact. 3 of these initiatives are on the infographic there. And our research findings have been used to shape and reform national policies in Wales. The first one of these is the Welsh Government's IT Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Recruitment Plan, which focuses on what can be done to increase recruitment of minority ethnic applicants onto IT programmes. Now, this is a pan-Wales approach as an attempt to increase the ethnic diversity of the workforce across the whole country. And to support that, each ITE partnership in Wales have had to produce their own plans as part of their own annual self-evaluation and improvement plan. I actually work predominantly within ITE, and I know that my colleagues have been, working hard as a separate group now, working with, our central university and Welsh Government to formulate that plan. The second initiative on there is the Welsh Government incentive, which is actually only been in place this year, and that's been in place to attract a more diverse teaching workforce. The scheme provides up to £5,000 to eligible individuals and to help to motivate them to think about teaching and to go into teaching as a career. And then last but not least is our DARPL project. DARPL stands for Diversity and Anti-Racist Professional Learning. This is a Welsh Government funded project where practitioners can get free professional learning to develop their knowledge and understanding of diversity and anti-racism in their own settings. In the first year of the project, the focus has been on school practitioners. The project is now in the second year where we are targeting early years and FE sectors. And it looks like the project will run for a few more years. Yeah, so this kind of briefly sums up our research, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it's interesting to hear from Wales, of course, because we have different exciting stuff happening, especially across Wales and Scotland. So it'll be interesting to see how that might and hopefully filter down to places like England as well. So thanks everyone for sharing. I'm going to pass on to Tara and her team now to share a little bit of their work and their paper before we close the contributions as well with 2 other colleagues. So thank you very much, Tara, and to your team as well for joining.
Thank you. So our paper is called Making Spaces for Collaborative Action in Learning, Reflections on Teacher-Led Decolonizing Initiatives from a Professional Learning Network in England. And I'm here with 2 of my colleagues who wrote vignettes for the paper and helped to write it. So for context, the 2017 Runnymede report, A City Divided, identified Bristol as being among the worst places in the country for race disparity in terms of education and employment outcomes. This was reinforced by 2020 DFE data on progress aid attainment, which identifies Bristol as having the worst outcomes for students from a Black African heritage. In response to this information and also to the Runnymede's recommendations to address representation in both teaching staff and curriculum, I founded the Bristol Decolonizing Network with my colleagues and as Foza is one of my fellow founding members as well, to consolidate and to support teacher-led decolonizing work across the city and further afield. It's a grassroots network. It's a flat structure, and it's grown from 26 teachers to 75 academics, teachers, and practitioners, roughly 50% from a visible minority. So our Bristol Decolonizing Network article shares the work of these teachers and the work that they're doing across subjects through a series of vignettes written by the teachers themselves, and it seeks to address the dearth of teacher-led research and practice in academic literature. And Foza is speaking next about her vignette and what she contributed.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'll try to be fast. So what prompted my journey to decolonization started with coming across Ngugi wa Thiong'o's nonfiction essay called Decolonizing the Mind. It centers primarily on the politics of language, especially from a colonization point of view. So it's basically how language or languages gain power because of the country that has colonized. And I was looking at it from a colonized person's point of view. And when I moved here about 9 years ago, I was I'm a trained teacher. I teach English, and the first thing that I came across center stage was the English canon. And what it did is it made my knowledge obsolete. My knowledge as an African teacher, as a Kenyan teacher, as a reader of African literature. So my journey really has been to try and legitimize my knowledge and make it worthwhile, and from the perspective of a citizen of our former colony, and also trying to make that knowledge relevant within my classroom. And my vignette has a few examples of how I have done that. Yeah.
Thank you, Fawza. So my contribution to the paper to follow on relates to our group, which is called the Decolonising Secondary Modern Foreign Languages Special Interest Group. It's a mouthful, so hereby just referred to as the SIG. We have over 70 members and a dedicated core of around 35, and they are largely practicing teachers from at all stages of their career, but we have educational publishers, academics at HE and in IT, which is where I'm based. So the whole teacher pipeline. And at our termly meetings, we have dedicated space to centre race and drill down into some of the unique ways that racism shows up in, but also is perpetuated by our own subject, our curricula, our practices, our systems, and ourselves, with a view to disrupting them. In this section of paper, we chart the story of the setting up of our SIG, the conditions which motivated its founding, and some of the outcomes. And while there wasn't necessarily the scope in the paper to go into detail about the many historic, present, and ongoing tensions, and they are material, emotional, psychosocial, of this work. During the SIG group meetings, and with thanks to Tara, Fawza and the other authors, during the collaboration process in the writing of this very paper itself, we did have a space, and that's so essential for counteracting the pervasive deracialisation that Heather and Vinny spoke to, and the narrowing parameters of centralised policy directives in the context of, you know, the What Works agenda that Ian Cushing has spoken to. What we hope is, by capturing a part of our origin story, we're supporting one of the key aims of our group, our SIG, which is to contribute to a long-term, ongoing and meaningful legacy which addresses the racism in our subject. And perhaps we're hoping it may be of support to others who are on similar paths for collective action to mobilise broader and more critical dialogues. So thank you.
Thank you to all of you. It is such an exciting paper that we had in this special issue to hear from the voices of practitioners on the ground and collectively organizing. It speaks back to the pockets of possibilities or the pedagogy of hope that Paulo Freire talks about, us coming together and resisting. So thank you very much for sharing that. That is a very hopeful paper in many ways, describing that origin history that you talked about, Lisa. I'm going to pass that, in terms of speaking of resisting, I'm going to pass now the torch to our next team, Claire and Penny, who will talk about their particular work with school leadership and thinking about what this conversation we are having today mean in the landscape of school leadership. So thank you, Claire and Penny, for joining us as well.
Thank you, Hyra, and thank you everybody for just really a great honour to be amongst such brilliance and people doing such brilliant work. I'm here representing Viv Grant, who isn't here, who wrote our paper, and also Professor Vinny Lander has very kindly asked Penny and I to represent our paper, which is called Resisting Whiteness, Anti-Racist Leadership and Professional Learning in Majority White Senior Leadership Teams in English Schools. And we were very interested in having undertaken national programmes around anti-racist leadership through the Anti-Racist Schools Award, which was written by Professor Vinnie Lando at Leeds Beckett, and the Race Identity and School Leadership Programme, which is a 24-hour across a year, across 8 sessions with intensive work with senior leadership teams. What did they make of it? What was the impact, and how did they negotiate the whiteness that they were in? So we interviewed 8 head teachers and senior leaders who'd undertaken the programme. So I'll just hand over to Penny to just share a little bit more about how we went about it.
Yep, so we conducted this small scale study exploring that interview data from 7 people who are leading on anti-racism in their schools, and we were looking to understand the role race plays in their schools, which had been experienced internationally by many white people as appearing suddenly visible and urgent due to Black Lives Matter movement and the inescapable reality of racism seen in George Floyd's violent public murder. So we carried out what we called in-depth conversations with people who were on these 2 programmes, the Anti-Racist School Award run by Leeds Beckett University and the Race Identity and School Leadership course run by Integrity Coaching, Viv Grant. We wanted to explore participants' subjective experiences, their own interpretations, their understanding of their own racialized identities and of whiteness in relation to the work that they're leading on. And we covered lines of inquiry around how senior leaders position themselves with respect to race and racism in education, how they negotiate their racialized identities amidst that, these anti-racist transformations that they're trying to create within their own institutions. And we also wanted to explore their kind of personal and professional changes, compromises, or even, what tools of resistance they identified, experienced, used to maintain or disrupt whiteness. And in terms of methods and conceptual frameworks and methodology, we were interested in the way that critical race theory and critical whiteness studies lend themselves to this kind of qualitative research, and as well as how we as white researchers form exploratory dialogue with participants which pushes against stereotypical power dynamics of the researcher and the researched, and which also explores whiteness while trying to avoid centering whiteness. So, we perceive ourselves as, I guess, scholar activists, so we're engaged in anti-racism work. It's not merely that we have an interest in it, and we work on these programs and we're research engaged. So the research is not merely about documenting, but it's also about active resistance, pooling and deepening knowledge. And Claire, maybe you'll talk us through the findings.
Yeah, I think some of the key findings, particularly at this time where people focus really on justifying the need for anti-racist work, particularly in schools that were majority white. So there was a lot of work and energy that had gone into kind of seeking permission. And obviously that was highly racialized by different people who were positioned in. There were 3 black or brown leaders who were had a different journey and had already negotiated many of the challenges in a different way. So we really tried to focus on the evasion aspect, the colour evasion, and I guess dig into, racism as not being over there, but racism being created within the systems and with it through policy enactment. So what we found was that there was despite that leaders identified their own gaps in knowledge from their own schooling. Even they were drawing on, in order to enact this work, they drew on their own schooling and were recognising their gaps for the first time. They had, as the programmes developed, there was a sense that they were connecting up the way that structural racism functions through them as leaders. So they referred to, for example, the way that whiteness is recentered through Ofsted, through policy, through things like political impartiality and how they got round it. They began to notice resistances of their staff and the shape that they took. And in particular, we used Bree Pekawa's tools of whiteness to try and kind of unearth and surface ideas around anti-racist work being, or any resistance to racism being positioned as kindness, as being really kind or well-intentioned leaders, rather than as safeguarding and preventing trauma and violence towards children. So it was there was a real lack of joining up that happened, and also the hyper visibility and invisibility of different leaders at different times. And I guess they came out with questions. Some of the interesting quotes were things like, how do I change something in a system that doesn't want to change? Everywhere I go, whiteness is being recentered. It's politically led by people in whiteness who haven't engaged in their own whiteness yet. Race discourse is positioned as threatening. And how on earth do I manage to negotiate? But even to get to that point, there was a huge effort in trying to unveil whiteness to people who were leading it. So it's a really interesting paper about kind of what we came out with as a kind of pretended ignorance, or a pretended kind of race neutrality. Yeah. There. So I just want to say thank you so much, and thank you to Vinny, who's been an enormous support to us, and thank you to Viv, who's not here but is here in spirit. So thank you to all.
And thank you everyone for coming up with this, writing this paper and doing this research. I found that very fascinating to read, even the notion of the races being created within and out there, from within and out there, because for a lot of us working as teacher educators and with school leadership, the people in school leadership position in majority white schools, that kind of conversation is extremely important to be had. So thank you very much for reporting on that trajectory. I'm going to pass to the last contributing group, who are also going to talk about school leadership, and specifically from the perspective of professional development. So I want to bring Sharon and Lee into the conversation to talk a little bit about their paper.
Lee's supposed to be going first. Are you there, Lee?
He's on mute, I think.
Oh, is he? Lee.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
The age old, you don't forget to turn the mic on. Yeah, so I'm Lee Walker. I'm a head teacher in East London School, and I paired up with Sharon and a couple of other head teachers to work on a piece of work which looks at a deep understanding for anti-racist school transformation, school leaders, professional development in the context of Black Lives Matter. Now, the starting point for myself and a few other head teachers, unfortunately, who are not able to join us today, was the death of George Floyd, and how that took place. That took place at a time when heads felt they weren't really sure how to approach that conversation in primary schools. The 4 heads involved have children in their schools who come from the Black community. And we felt that we weren't really in a position to be able to have those conversations with our pupils, with our staff, and ultimately with our wider community. We felt that actually we were in a position where, of conversation of such a sensitive matter, you would have to be very careful in terms of how you approach that conversation, and found that obviously that depending on our own experiences of life, we would approach those conversations from very different avenues, and knowing that actually that wouldn't be the best way of dealing with it, because actually you can easily upset people along that journey. So one of the heads in the conversation looked at how they wanted to work with their staff in terms of how they would be able to facilitate conversations with their staff, but also felt that because they were a white person, that they weren't necessarily best equipped to be able to have those conversations. But I also knew myself as a head teacher, that being a Black person, that I might come into that conversation with my own bias and experiences of the system in which I've grown up in. So we decided that we clearly needed some support to be able to facilitate conversations with school leaders, and also with our own staff. And at which point we were fortunate enough to, that I was able to approach Sharon Walker to do some work with us. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Sharon.
Okay, so just to say, we're brother and sister. We're not husband and wife. We're not. That's my baby brother. Okay, so what was I going to say? Yeah, so as Lee was saying, I think one of the things to just pull out from what Lee was saying, that when teachers first came together, that as well as thinking about how do we respond to what is happening in the wider sphere, i.e. George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, that the teachers, that they wanted to think about not just having conversations, but what this meant for their school practice, because they had already been talking about the fact that there were issues in their school around teachers wanting to do things around decolonizing, wanting to do things around anti-racist practice, but they didn't know how to bring everything together. And so so we got together and we developed, I say we, me and the working group, Lee and 3 others who are also named on the paper, we got together and we developed a series of workshops, which we ran. We put it out to the whole of the network, which is about 51 schools, and then altogether around about 20 school leaders took part over 6 sessions over an academic year. And one of the things that we found when we first decided to do this is that there were teachers who were wanting to, if you like, because of the climate that we're in, wanting to focus on outcomes and practice. How can we translate this immediately into practice? What does this mean? But then there were another segment of teachers who thought, right, we as school leaders need time to reflect and think. And so there was always that tension between the two. So what the workshops did in the main is that it gave teachers that opportunity to come together and think, to begin to engage with many of the concepts that they saw out there, for example, decolonizing, understanding what that meant from literature, from conversations that were happening, and then in turn what that could potentially mean for their school communities and their school practice. And then also, more importantly, school leaders thinking, how do we develop our understanding such that when we then approach the wider school about these issues, that we're not bringing this as something that's top down. We're not saying you have to do these things. How do we in the long run engage them in these kind of conversations of deep understanding such that they come on board because they recognize the value and the necessity of doing this, not because somebody has told them to do it. And so, yeah, so what we did throughout the workshops, just very quickly, we didn't set out as a research project. We set out as a workshop activity, but then we did gather along the way, whether that be through recording sessions, through online surveys, through live feedback that we recorded as we went along. We had a record of what we were experiencing, and then we had focus groups where teachers were able, the participants were able to reflect on the experience we had, to draw out what was important, what worked, and what could be valuable going forward. And we came to a realization that we kind of described it as deep understanding because they had had the time to think. It sounds a ridiculous thing, isn't it? But there is just no time. Once you come out of teacher training, if ever you meet anything to do with anti-racism in teacher training, if you're lucky, once you start teaching, there is no time again to learn and think. And they had that time. And so we kind of focus on that kind of deep understanding within communities of reflection, communities of practice. And now we're thinking now, what are the next steps? How do we now bring these things to the wider school community? There's already work that has started to happen. People have gone and began to cascade that learning down and trying to tap into different parts of the school community. But now we're thinking about how can we take this approach and find kind of a coherent way that we can bring this into wider practice. Okay, that's us.
I think what's been quite key for building on from what Sharon just said, what's been quite key within all the work that we've been doing is within our school community, but also within the groups of schools that we're working with, is that there is common understanding around certain terminology. So regardless of where you move between the settings, that everyone understands what particular terminology means. And I think the importance been there has having that time to step back, to reflect as head teachers. The luxury of being able to have 30 seconds to reflect is quite nice, but to be able to actually step back and reflect, to work out how to build upon something that ultimately needs to be sustainable. It needs to make a difference, and it's not just a case of we're just going to pop a sticky plaster on it today and hope that sticky plaster holds while I'm still in my job, knowing that the chances are 5 years down the line we'll be back in the same position, but it's about making sure that the change that we make now actually has a significant impact on the next generation.
Thank you very much to the siblings in this presentation. And I think there's such a strong message coming through all the presentations, but that you very neatly summarized with the notion of deep learning. And I think looking back at policy and ITE frameworks and other policies that guide and go over in our work as teachers and teachers, educators and school leaders is this notion of having more than 30 seconds to reflect and to actually work together as communities of learning and practice, where we can empower each other to keep learning and instead of just jumping into practice without that kind of, we talk about that in teacher education all the time. We talk about the reflexive practitioner, but that first part of the term might not be available to a lot of us. So it's lovely to hear from those experiences where that is actually being put in place for practitioners. I'm conscious of time, and of course we have the presence of the great Professor Marlon Moncrieff here with us today. So I might go straight into his contributions, and then of course I'll keep an eye on the Padlet if any other questions emerge, and we might have a bit of time at the end to talk about it together. So I am gonna first thank you very much, Marlon, for agreeing to come in and offer your words of wisdom about all the presentations and the special issue, and share your expertise in this area as well. So just as a way of brief introduction, Professor Marlon Moncrieff is a principal lecturer at the School of Education at the University of Brighton. He's also a member of BIRA, or behind the organization of the event today, and a fellow of the Chartered College of Teaching. And Marlon is well known for his work in the colonizing curriculum and with particular expertise in history and primary education, but has published a lot in this area. So Marlon, thank you again for joining us, and I'll open the floor to you for your commentary at the end of this event.
Firstly, thank you to Curriculum Journal editors Mark Creasley, Elizabeth Rushton and Haifa Gandolfi and Bira for giving me this slot to add some commentary toward the special issue, and the fantastic contributions given today by colleagues, excellent contributions. And I've obviously read through the journal, and I've seen in these articles the power of epistemic freedom in the writing and the communication for producing what I would call liberatory knowledges for arresting the teacher, education and national curriculum policy concealments of crime. What do I mean by crimes? Well, I mean, these are crimes that I see detected by the authors in these policies. Firstly, the crime of epistemic violence in the racial discourses of whiteness by the uncritical enactment of national curriculum teaching and learning policies. Secondly, the crime of deracialization of government teacher educational policy by the absent discourses for teaching and learning on race, racism and anti-racism, which is much needed in support of our vivid multiracial society. The esteemed decolonial academic Sabella Ndlovu-Getshini states, writers on politics, which I believe are you, do not merely write about politics, they take clear sides in the battlefield of ideas where the oppressed and violated confront the oppressors and the well-crafted systems, structures, institutions, strategies and games of oppression, exploitation and dehumanization. I think the articles in this special issue engage powerfully in the politics of education curriculum making as a struggle of knowledge production, and in exposing in government discourses what Getshini speaks of as epistemic and ideological trickery. The majority of the articles frame these challenges as the given discourses of teacher education policy and policies for curriculum teaching and learning, seeking to arrest the uncritical enactment of these by educators in reification of neoconservative, neoliberal government ideologies. Vinnie Landers and Heather Smith's work, Finding Pockets of Possibility for Anti-Racism in a Curriculum for Student Teachers from Absence to Action, this gets straight to the business in exposing the policy handcuffs on the risks of educators who must demonstrate that their curriculum fully incorporates the state-mandated core curriculum framework. Landers and Smith exposed this as a government policy without any reference to race, racism, anti-racism, racism, even the terms prejudice. And this grabbed my interest immediately in exposing the absences of teaching and learning about the history of ethnic diversity in the primary school history aims and contexts, work that I've been looking at for the last 5 years or so. I saw a similar link in the article given by Ian Cushion's identification of racio-linguistic policy assemblages and white supremacy in teacher education. This includes the teacher standards, core curriculum content framework, the primary history curriculum, and added to this last year's new guidance for schools on political impartiality, including the requirement to teach about racism, empire, and colonialism in a balanced manner. Cushion's revelations of epistemic trickery through racial linguistic policy discourses are important warnings of durable beliefs about language which maintains systems of white supremacy by perceiving racialized speakers' languages perhaps as deficient, lacking, and subhuman. And I see that this article relates strongly to that of Oakley Welpley's English as additional language, Decolonising Provision and Practice, which gives on how a deficit view of newly arrived migrant students is inscribed within nationalist imperialist ideologies rooted in colonialism and white supremacy, in which the linguistic practices of young people from immigrant backgrounds are constructed as illegitimate or the other. For me, this article exposes how educational policy over the last decade have suppressed funding for ethnic minority students, EMAG, in creating an unequal provision across the country, putting pressure on mainstreaming practices in England. Thus, enacting decolonial practice through our work as a route to the subversion of racist policy is required. I think Gabby and colleagues in their article discuss this and give caution as to what they describe as barriers created as an impasse in ITE, where there seems to be no clear direction in the body of knowledge or will to change, where student teachers are left to work things out for themselves. And this is extremely concerning. Further, they discuss Black and Asian student teachers in the minority in IT feeling deficient and irrelevant because they are not listened to or repeated or represented, where white student teachers who desire to move forward in equitable education are ill-equipped to challenge their whiteness and privilege and may ironically reproduce harmful colonial practices. And I get a similar feel from the article of Davis et al. And colleagues in their discussion of the disproportionate number of teachers of colour in Wales in comparison to pupils of colour, and particularly the insights of their courageous conversations with teachers and learners of colour. What the set of articles does is give and show the importance of school leadership, and this is considered clearly in issues where gains can be made through anti-racist curriculum knowledge transference. Claire Stewart Hall and colleagues give an analysis and evaluation of 2 anti-racism programmes and gives evidence on the impact of professional learning which can have an impact on school leaders, as does the work of Walker and colleagues in their discussion of deep understanding for anti-racist school transformation in school leaders' professional development. Decoloniality and anti-racist action, impactful in a similar way to that of Gloak and colleagues, can be enacted and supported by a reflective community of practice which can engage with decolonial praxis. I think what makes this special issue explicit is that teacher and educators and teachers in England and Wales are chained to a hostile policy architecture which has long sought to reduce and discredit opportunities for critical anti-racist curriculum building. Thus, policy reform is desperately needed. These are valuable contributions to the field, which together form an extremely important collection of articles in giving broad coverage of decolonial anti-racist perspectives for teacher training and education across England and Wales. Congratulations to everybody indeed. These articles must be disseminated widely across the Academy and to leaders of ITE for sharing with student teachers in support of their quality professional development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marlon. To you as well for agreeing to contribute to the event. Is a pleasure to have you here, and as it's a pleasure to have everyone else working with us on this special issue. Since we have a couple of minutes, I cannot help myself and put a question to everyone here from me, and I think it speaks back to what Marlon just mentioned at the end of his contribution in relation to the shackles of policy, and thinking about the work that lots of you here in this special issue referred to in terms of the different policy documents that we have guiding our work, particularly in England. And this is, I think, some of the things that we see when we engage with the colleagues from Wales and when we engage with colleagues from Scotland, thinking about the different ways policy for teacher education and for teachers' work have been reframed recently across those other two countries. And then when we are working here from England, we look at those things and keep thinking about what is the landscape for us in terms of policy and our future work in this area. So I'm just going to put a question to everyone here, and then of course whoever wants to jump in. Thinking about, you know, the beginning, the first presentations in relation to pockets of possibilities or propulsion points and all this and an idea of the pedagogy of hope, you know, this idea of trying to be hopeful. What do we see as the future for our engagement with this policy landscape? I mean, what are your impressions, and there's impressions from the team here on the panel, about where can we go, to what extent can we go far in the resisting work and in this resisting and hopeful work and finding pockets of possibility? Where do you think we can go from within the system? I'm just going to put it out there, and if anyone wants to come in and talk a little bit about, perhaps a little bit about next stages in the future of our work within the policy landscape. Vinny, please. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Hira and Lizzie, and also to Mark and Stavroula for the special issue. As Marlon said, it's a really important special issue, and it mustn't stand on its own, that there should be a follow-up. So I think that's my short answer to your question, Hira. But I think we also need to take hope from the community that we're building here. And just recently we had a conference in Leeds organised by the Centre for Race Education Decoloniality on the anti-racist initial teacher education framework, and from that we're going to be launching an anti-racist teacher education network, so that people like the people that are on this call can join that network, and we can actually join forces, share good practice, but also begin to infiltrate policy spaces that we're in, so that and so that we can begin to effect change. So those policy spaces are, you know, canvassing, emailing your MP, emailing the shadow cabinet in terms of the education minister, the higher education minister. We really need to use the levers that we've got as individual citizens, but also as a collective. So I think those are the next steps for me. And of course, anti-racist teacher educators includes teachers as well.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Vinny. And I think one of the things that really excited Lizzie and I when we start organizing the special issue and then seeing the papers coming through is this diversity of voices contributing to this special issue, and diversity of voices who can do and contribute in different ways to the collective struggles. I think even what you just said in relation to the teachers in the schools, and having, for instance, Tara's team here and Lee joining us, you know, the school leaders, the school practitioners, and having their voices as part of this special issue was really important to us because of that collective construction, and in a way that might allow us to occupy spaces that we don't normally occupy, especially in policy making. And I think that speaks back to something that Mark said right at the beginning in terms of the curriculum journal opening new avenues for publications from people coming, for instance, from schools, or like educational practitioners on the ground. So that there's some exciting stuff that you mentioned in terms of coming together in the network, that we would hope people attending the event today would really keep an eye on for further information about all those different ways of coming together. Just to close the event, I think, and on that note, part of the special issue is our closing editorial. Lizzie and I wrote a closing editorial, and one of the things that I mentioned already, but we also raised in that editorial, is the fact that we originally opened this special issue to contributions from across the UK. So we were hoping to get contributions from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. But what I think everyone can see in this special issue is that we are most of the contributions are focusing on England in this special issue. And we would like to use this space here with attendees and everyone joining us to raise the point that it would be extremely exciting to see new things coming from Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland in this area, because especially across, like I said, Wales and in Scotland, we are seeing some interesting and exciting initiatives. So we are hopeful that this can be a starting point for us to start speaking across the UK as well, and learn from each other and learn and share in the kind of collective spaces. Something that we also flagged, and this all leaving food for thought and ideas for future research for those attending here today and listening to us as well, is thinking about subject knowledge and subject specific work and subject knowledge. Lizzie is a geographer, I am a scientist, so we are very much attached to our subject identities as secondary teachers, and we are extremely hopeful to harness the subject expertise of people working those particular areas and thinking about what that might mean for our practices in all those different subjects, going beyond the traditional humanities work that is usually done. So hopefully we can inspire here with this lovely group and beyond the lovely group, people to look into those different buckets of possibilities across our subject areas as well. And a final note, which we also mentioned in the editorial, is that we see, Marlon also mentioned that, this obfuscation and these discourses and these struggles that we all see across the papers in terms of enacting change and resisting. But we are also extremely hopeful by seeing so many different diverse voices coming into this special issue and contributing to the resistance movement. So we hope that this event today, not just the special issue as a written piece, but this event today will empower us even more to come together and keep resisting through communities of practice to collectivization. So thank you. I'm going to use this to close the event now, mindful of time. So I want to thank everyone for contributing to this special issue, for coming to this event, for calling for further networking, for further collective work. We hope this can be the starting point of something even bigger. So again, thanks to all the authors who joined us and those who did not manage to come today, of course. Thanks to the reviewers who helped us getting this special issue together. Thank you very much to our editors at the Curriculum Journal, Mark and Stravula. And thanks to the Bureau event teams as well, who helped us put this event together. Without further ado, because as a former classroom teacher, I can keep going and talking of all over. So I'm gonna again close this event. Once again, thank you everyone for joining, for your lovely contributions and for your patience with us. And hopefully we will come across each other in the supportive spaces a lot more in the near future. So thanks everyone once again.